Hey, 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 live on LinkedIn and wherever else. Welcome, Series C Success. Essentially, we're just trying to talk about strategic hiring for scalable growth, which is really exciting for me. I know I get excited for every webinar, but not only do we have an all-woman crew here, but this is something that I don't feel like is talked about enough. And what excites me as well is we have both sides here. Hiring is something that should be talked about in the entire organization. Everyone should be accountable: the TA, recruiting, the execs, the founders, the interviewers, the hiring managers. This is a conversation that is well suited for everybody. So very inclusive of us. I'm excited. Before we get into it, I have some intros to go out to. So the sponsors today is Covey. So it's getcovey.com. As a talent leader, you're facing tons of challenges, which again is why we're here, right? We're here to provide a positive candidate experience, but we also have to manage a lot of other things with a very small team. So Covey Scout is an AI-powered sourcer. It can quickly and easily screen through thousands of job applications and identify the top 5%, which is pretty amazing, and it can do it in an hour. And they're currently helping tech teams like DoorDash, Rippling, and they streamline the recruitment process, saving a significant of time and money. So thank you for that. I've used them for many years on something different, more of like my sourcing. But anyways, let's meet our guests. So we have Lauren, who is a strategic recruiting leader with over 13 years in the tech industry. She has helped scale powerhouse companies like Eventbrite, Slack, Lattice. At Eventbrite, she drove growth from 200 to 1,000. That is so much. And then Slack, it scaled 150 to 2,000. And then most recently at Lattice, Lauren built and expanded the technical recruiting team, developed the company's first sourcing function. I want to hear about that. And led Lattice's international expansion into Portugal. And Lattice went from 300 to 750. So there is a lot of growth there. I'm excited. So your extensive experience in building high impact recruiting teams is invaluable. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
Good to see you. All right. So now I'm excited to introduce Adrienne. She is a recruitment leader whose journey spans from corporate law, which is another webinar, I feel, on how this came about. But DEI, equitable hiring. So after studying pre-law at UC Berkeley, Adrienne transitioned from corporate law to focus on re-entry advocacy, joining a Y Combinator DEI startup. So now as the head of recruitment at Volley, a Y Combinator-backed voice AI gaming company, Adrienne has led the organization from Series A to Series C as the first internal recruiting hire. Not a lot of people can say they've been through all the series, so hopefully we got a pre-IPO coming. But she is implementing inclusive hiring processes that attract top talent from all backgrounds. So welcome, Adrienne. How you doing?
Very good. Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, excited. So for all you that have seen the webinars, we like to dig. We like questions. If you have some, we want you to ferociously be writing, some of this stuff down. And what we are going to do today is mostly about Series C, but naturally we start planning Series C and during Series B, right? So Lauren, let's start with you. How do you really define strategic hiring for Series C? Like what's really crucial? Because strategic hiring, data-driven, all that stuff are things that are thrown out a lot. So
How do you define strategic hiring? I mean, I think part of it is being really realistic about where the company is at. I've spoken to a lot of companies at B, C, D stage, and I feel like they're always apologetic about where they are in the headcount planning process. And I always say I've been at companies that, have gone to 2,000 people, that have done an IPO. And I really have never seen a beautifully shaped, working like clockwork hiring plan. So I think it's about being a little bit easy on yourself. And so strategic is really like meeting where you are at the moment while also pushing yourself forward to where you want to be, getting that rigor in place, having a single source of truth, having really open communication between so many different channels. It isn't execs and TA. It's also the finance team and the people who are really rolling up their sleeves and working with you. The HRBPs as well, who are helping to shape what those teams need to look like and partnering with the organizations to create that ideal scenario. The most success I've seen, I think we did it really, really well at Lattice, was when all of those folks were on the same page, brought along from the beginning. Where I've seen struggles happen is where those important cross-functional partners are brought in at the end of a process. And they're like, wait, why are we hiring for this role? And all of a sudden you have your dream candidate, you want to get an offer out, and the brakes are put on. So when I think about strategic, I do think about incredible communication, looping in folks that they're really on the same page. And that to me is a really strong strategy. I'm curious what you're seeing, Adrian, around the same, topic.
Yeah, very similar sentiments. I think especially the point around ensuring that people are brought in early. We are not a massive organization at this point, so it is very doable for us to ensure that we have the right people in the room, but that gets harder as you grow. It looks very different now than it did at Series A or even Series B. And part of that is ensuring that there's consistency in terms of the spaces that are carved out to have those conversations. The other side of it is, like, for example, here at Volley, I meet with the C-suite team weekly or monthly rather, and we talk through data, processes, et cetera, on the talent side of the house to understand where we're at. And reiterating your point about not bringing people into the last minute, the executive team should have awareness of where the talent team sits, given the criticalness of headcount as it relates to business goals, and ensuring that that consideration is baked into the overall business goals and strategies. And the other side of it is that hiring leaders have a really unique lens on the business. They work across the organization. They see what the current team is, maybe where some of the bottlenecks are. And they can also, to some degree, help hold the line around what is needed and where. I mean, that's true for our organization here at this size, and hopefully you have talent in the room as you're having these conversations.
Yeah.
One other component to this question that I was thinking about as Adrian was talking is, I think at Series C, you're also at an important point to start talking about documentation and really writing down things like your compensation philosophy, your negotiation philosophy. So you're really on the same page when it comes to different components of hiring. There's so many amazing tools out there that hopefully there's a consistent one at your company. And I think documentation is actually an important strategic component as well, so that you're really all speaking the same language and on the same page.
Yeah, words definitely matter. So
Yeah.
getting lost in translation is really important. I always think of an audience as well. I feel like that's put into like admin work, but that's not admin work. That's just going back to what you originally said, which is the source of truth.
Yeah.
It's like, what are we all saying? And can we all, essentially, I think of it as, can we all pitch the same dream?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't, then there's like a bunch of issues. Lauren, I was actually surprised when you talked about the finance team, because not a lot of people think, duh, they're like a giant component to all of this and the comp, and like they absolutely have to sit down. But that's one team that I feel like gets forgotten about sometimes when it comes to hiring strategically, and going back to, can each team like validate who we're hiring, why we're hiring, and the cost of it.
Yeah.
Because I can't help but say this, I say it often, we've had tons of layoffs, right? We've seen it now for the past 2.5, 3 years at this point, maybe even longer. But anyways, the point is that if I think TA always had a spot and always kind of hosted those conversations as to, why are we doing this? Could we train? Could, like all of these questions, if all the right questions were asked, would we still have massive layoffs like this?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really have the answer to that, but it's like, we can only move forward and do better. But yeah, I think about how many times I've had like a dream candidate, and it gets to the end and they're like, oh wait, we don't need this role. And I always think to myself, no one figured this out
Yeah,
like a month ago or 2 months ago. And I think about how many hours are wasted with interviewers and hiring managers and stuff like that. So I guess my next point and question, I'll go to Adrian first, would be, we talked about a couple of the common pitfalls, but like, how do we try to avoid them besides communication and talking through things? What have you seen?
Sure. I would say a really defining part of witnessing and overseeing this scale at Volley is how processes themselves change. And so part of that growth consideration is how you are changing the processes that you have in place to account for these things at each stage in the process. Because early on, it's like you're the source of truth. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that exists in like one or two people or a small group of people. And as you're scaling, you need to be baking these considerations into the way that, for example, headcount requests are even put through to the talent team. Is it filtering through finance? Is it filtering through the executive team? Is there a space to talk about these new headcount requests? A big consideration for us there was, I mean, especially as an early stage startup, resources are the most important part of any conversation. How are you considering what resources you have available to you when you have a very lean recruiting team that doesn't have a huge amount of capacity to work on a headcount request that ends up getting terminated? So the solution there is to go back to how did that headcount request get approved in the first place and who's involved in those conversations. So that's one element of it. I think the other element of it is talking about the actual interview process itself. I think there's two sides to growth and strategy as it relates to headcount. One side is the business outcome and the goals. The other side of it is going to be the team itself. It's a waste of resources if you hire, not a waste of resources, you learn things, but if you hire somebody that ends up not being a fit, or if it takes too long to hire somebody. So looking at the other side of things, who's involved in your interviewing processes? How are they being trained? How are they understanding what role this hire would make within the organization? I think we'll probably get to this later, but a big thing that we saw was like really agnostic interview processes where interviewers were kind of interviewing for roles across the organization. And things can get lost there. You can miss out on good talent. You can hire the wrong person. And so understanding how the talent that's coming in relates to your interviewing team and training your interviewers accordingly. I got a little bit tangential towards the end there, but I will pause there.
No, it's good. I mean, training. It's like, that's a whole, honestly, it might even be a whole webinar. I do want to touch about it in a little bit because it's so crucial, like to your point of like not wasting time because people join organizations for people, for other people. So it's so crucial that they're trained. Lauren, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I think especially for talent leaders, it's really important that you are naming almost like the intangible, the things that are feeling off, that are feeling wrong, really being able to like look around corners, but like pinpoint the nebulous issues. And I think that comes from, like we were talking about earlier, having open communication, being in the room when you're having these strategic discussions. I think it's also really important to create psychological safety for your recruiting team so that they're coming to you with things that might seem like one-off situations, but you as the leader start seeing the pattern. Okay, things are feeling off with design hiring. Let me just sort of keep a running list, whether it's literally written down in your head, however you work, and being that person who then comes up with the solution. And that's how you can kind of nip things in the bud before it's a train running off the tracks. And I agree about the interview process. I think that you need to encourage the organization to really lower their egos and say like, what's working and what isn't. And talk about it. It is no one's fault if the interview questions aren't landing and we're not getting signal. It is no one's fault if candidates are falling out of the process. Let's pinpoint it and figure out how to move forward in a better way. And so I think really leading by example with that low ego is super important, especially at this like Series C type size where you're in that sort of tweenage age of a company and things can start getting awkward and you're outgrowing a lot of processes.
All right, I want to know, it's almost like a role play, but I want to know, Lauren, how you get rid of ego, because like, I know, like I've worked with clients who think they're the best company in the whole wide world. And I do think that when you're at a company, you should really feel proud of your team and your product and whatever you're building, right? But let's be honest, how many other great Series C companies, like let's just assume the candidate wants a Series C, right? How many great companies are there available? And with all the remote work out there, there's a lot more competition. So how do we also pitch and make, and with, just go for it. Like, how do you lower egos? There's other options for them.
I think the first thing I do is like lead by example, talk about things that maybe even just broadly I'm working on professionally to show that like no one is without, excuse me, no one is without their flaws. So, you know, I'm still trying to work on X, Y, or Z, like build those relationships where you're really open about, you know, where you feel really confident and where you're working on, and like creating that partnership, whether it's a direct report, whether it's a peer, whether you're managing up, all of those things, just showing that you yourself are kind of being trusting and lowering your ego. But I also like to sort of tell tales with both qualitative and quantitative data. I think that bringing that together tells the full story. So if you're bringing, for example, candidate feedback with also data from the ATS and really layering that over, it's telling the full story. You're hearing feedback from the candidates about, you know, what's going wrong, what they liked in the process, what they didn't, but then you're also showing things like pass-through rates or time and stage, or, you know, just whatever's off. And that, I think, helps you have a common thing to point to. It helps people kind of lower their ego and really talk about how can we solution this. That's my approach.
Yeah, because I think there's a fine line between hiring an ad and a fit. And they all have to kind of, you know, come together. So Adrienne, I know with like Bali in particular, like it's hybrid and it's in San Francisco. So you're dealing with, again, back to my point, a lot of people who want to be remote perhaps. So how are you, but you also are in growth stage. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So I think, to Lauren's point, you can appeal, you know, emotionally in a lot of different ways. There will be different relationships that you have with different leaders or candidates. But at the end of the day, you have something that you can point to that can back up that narrative that is irrefutable. So that would be the data side of the house. That works, you know, to some degree internally and maybe externally. I think for us, when you look at results, you will see what's working and what isn't. If we are high level, making this appeal to, you know, the opportunity that exists here, but we're not getting the talent that we want to get, that merits us re-examining our compensation, our process, the overall candidate experience, even without, you know, the survey from the candidates themselves. If we're not seeing the results we want to see, that's a reflection on us. And I think that point itself will ring true no matter where you are. And if we're having a conversation about ego, we're not making something happen, you know, in a consistent manner, that merits revisiting. And I think that language is understood by everyone. As it relates to us with like a hybrid environment and being in San Francisco, I think the other side of it is, you know, who are you targeting in your outreach? What elements of this opportunity align to the candidate's experience and their motivations? I think every talent person will understand that having a relationship and understanding the candidate's motivations plays a really key role, regardless of company stage or size or the role itself. And at the end of the day, you can do everything right in terms of compensation or equity or role scope. But if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit. And I will add a final note there that we definitely early on, like we didn't have a website, nobody knew who we were. A big part of what we were doing was crafting a pitch that appealed to the candidate's motivation. That has remained true over time. We've just gotten better at it, and we've been able to scale it a little better as well.
I was going to add with your point, Adrienne, that I think it's really helpful for hiring partners, whether it's the hiring manager or executives, that you're talking about what you're going to fix kind of in the short term, but it is also the long term of saying, we don't have a great employer brand. I'm not saying you're saying that, but like that could be one thing where you're like, this is what we're going to work on for the next 6 to 12 months. And here's some of the things we're going to do. I'll give you updates once a month about what we've done, what we're seeing, et cetera. Like having both of those in tandem is really important. You know, being able to take a step back and see the longer term vision. And another point, going back to sort of my documentation piece with, my amazing boss at Lattice, Emily Zahuda, she and I created like this offer close plan, and we used it for every single candidate. And in it, you're basically taking all of that incredible information in the recruiter's mind and putting it on the paper. So all the folks who are helping you close that candidate, whether it's someone from an ERG who's jumping on a call with them to discuss inclusion at the company, whether it's your head of finance who's talking about what equity means, whether it's the hiring manager, et cetera, they still are seeing like, okay, but how should I frame this conversation? Is it about career growth? Is it about work-life balance? What really motivates this candidate? And so I think, again, like you say documentation and you're at Series C and you're like, no, it's going to slow us down. We got to go. Moving fast is important. But sometimes slowing down a little bit can help you move so quickly and see those offer accept rates skyrocket because everyone is aligned and kind of, reassuring the candidate very genuinely about the things that matter to them.
It goes back to everyone speaking the same exact language. So slow down to speed up is something that everybody needs to talk about because, again, I get it, like quick, fast, hyper growth. I mean, it's called hyper growth mode for a reason, right? Growth stage, whatever you want to call it. So my main question, because I know, like I've seen companies, from A to pre-IPO or IPO actually. So I've been on that side. But I want to know internally, do you have conversations about what skills and qualities you look for at this stage versus what you looked for at Series A, perhaps? So, Adrienne, let's start with you because you've seen the A through C. So has that conversation changed?
Sure. So again, I'll point to the process. And I think the way our interview processes themselves have changed as a reflection of this. I pointed to something called like agnostic interviewing early on, which was we're a small team, like the engineering team was 20 people. Everyone's kind of tapped into what everyone else is doing. I think hiring process itself reflected that. We had this, I know that there's a lot of negative connotation around unicorn, but we had this like unicorn hire for Volley. There was somebody that had the skills that Volley needed. That was both soft skills and hard skills. And so the process itself, you could kind of pull in anybody from any technical team to interview, engineering team to interview. There was an understanding of what each team needed because what Volley needed was all kind of small enough to understand each of those nuances. As we grow, obviously that's not going to scale. And in part because you will get short-stopped or stopped up if you have this kind of unicorn candidate in mind when you have 10 senior software engineer roles to hire for. You can no longer look for somebody who hits every single mark, in part because Volley itself is changing. The organization is changing. And so you start to take a look at the nuances of the skills that are needed for each of these roles and the teams that they will be joining. The interview process itself, will kind of fracture into these little pieces that are team specific, oriented around, okay, well, here's our overall tech stack. But in this specific team, we're really looking for somebody who's extremely back-end focused and has 5 years of experience in this area, even if they're a little bit lacking over here. In this other area we have in the job description. And so the processes themselves have remained kind of the same skeleton, but the people who are involved in those processes and the understanding that they have of what their team needs is the key distinguishing factor and kind of progress that I've seen over time. It sounds great. There's always going to be some challenges in there, but ultimately ensuring that the teams that are interviewing, I have recruiters on my team who will sit down with members of their team, the team they're hiring for, and talk through that. The other side of it is going to be the hiring manager themselves. What does your intake form look like? Are they looking at their current team and assessing where the gaps are and not pitching this ideal candidate that's not based in reality, if you will. But taking a look at, because we all know that happens, taking a look at who is on your team, where are the gaps, how would this map to the role that you're hiring for, and get them thinking that way before the role even opens.
Yeah, and I think it's also really good to be asking kind of just that question. What does this look like today, 6 months, 12 months from now? And depending on where you are in terms of the growth of the company, how do you think that your team looks different now that we're where we are today? You know, a little bit of just like basically asking what you asked of us, of the hiring manager, and saying like, what's changed? I think when I think about who we were hiring at Slack in 2015 versus who we were hiring in 2020, very different profile, right? And we had incredible conversations at Slack about what does our culture mean at 140 people? What does it mean at 250? What does it mean at 800, et cetera? And then that needs to percolate down to our hiring as well. Our approach, the profiles we're looking for, you know, what does grit mean at 140 people? What does it mean at 1,800 people, et cetera? You still have the same culture, but it is defined in a slightly different way based on the business challenges that you're facing.
So I'll say gossip on the streets is that when you're in hyper growth mode, your bar lowers. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Like, I actually have clients, for example, who will tell me, oh, I love people from LinkedIn from this time to this time. If they're hired afterwards, I don't want them, kind of thing. Like, they'll literally say years. Like, oh, I liked Uber from this one to this one. You know, so there's definitely reputations. What's your response to that? Like, have you seen that at all? Or?
Well, I think philosophically, it's talent acquisition's job to not let that bar lower because hiring managers might be feeling desperate. It is really our job to say, I know you want this person hired yesterday. We are doing X, Y, or Z to make it happen. I am not going to let you hire someone who isn't what your team needs or what your team needs A+. So I hear you. And I think that that is the fear, that when you're hiring quickly, you're desperate, but it should be talent acquisition's job to keep that in check.
Yeah, to get ahead of it. Adrienne, what have you seen?
It's an interesting question. I think, you know, if you take a look at the interview process itself, there have been no changes in scoring, right? Like what our top scores might look like on any given interview panel. So the process itself is the same. The people who are involved have expanded. They're bringing different perceptions to this same process. And there will be differences. You are going to see hiring decisions get made with different people in the room that look very different than it did a couple of years ago with a much smaller and or different hiring team. No. Does the bar lower? I can't answer that, because I think the bigger question is like, what do you have in place? What are you really looking for? And how does your process reflect that? And I think ultimately the quality question is something that is like somewhat, it's very subjective, I guess. Yeah. I would say. And if you hire somebody who can do the job, you know, then the job is done. So I think early on, while you were speaking, actually, I was reflecting on the fact that I was in the room like with volley teams who were making decisions on the engineering side of the house and really forcing us to examine the piece I mentioned earlier, where it was like the bar was really high because we were a small team. And I think a really big part of that is when you're a smaller organization, everyone like wants to like each other and hang out with each other, and it's a smaller group of people, and so there are some more indefinable qualities that get baked into the interview process that maybe as you scale, you know, get lost, I guess. But I don't necessarily want that to have a negative connotation, because I think there's some value to that growth and that expansion, and bringing new perspectives into the room. So that's what I would say. I guess it's kind of a non-answer, but like,
yeah, no, I like it because
what I've seen.
Yeah, well, it brings it to the DEI stuff, I think, where it's like, okay, now we should have thought about this in the beginning. We were moving too fast to worry or think about or anything. Like, what is this? How does this define? So now it's like, how do we still keep our inclusion plans thoughtful as we're trying to be speedy? Like, that's always the problem. It's like quality versus quantity. And it's like, how do we work? How do we do this?
Yeah. And another thing I was going to add too is what I've loved about the like data and analytics tools that have come out in the past, maybe, or have improved in the past 5 years or so, is you can look at things like, you can look at interviewers and their scorecards and see the trends that are happening. Is someone a really easy interviewer and they're just saying yes all the time and they're always giving a yes or strong yes and they have no no's on their scorecards? What's happening here? Let's calibrate. And again, like doing that layering of what are the scorecards showing us? and what are the success of the folks who are getting hired, and really pulling that apart and doing the deep dive into the trends that you're seeing and making sure that you're making the right hire. Hiring managers are happy. Folks are staying at the company for a long time. And yeah, I just think that there's tools like, Gem and Ashby, where they're incredible data that we can look at now that is so much more granular than we had 5 years ago.
Yep. I love that you brought up retention.
Yeah.
So what we tend to see, and I don't know if it's because equity, you vest at 4 years, so it all depends on like what series happens at what year, right? What growth stage. But you tend to see people like kind of fall off during hyper growth, and it's like they feel maybe they're not as important, right? So we talk about how we keep the culture somewhat the same as we can, but naturally more people brings different challenges. So I guess the question is, how do you really hold tight on retention and keep them constantly focused on the mission at hand? Because that seems hard.
I'll pull from what I felt like Slack had really strong retention. You weren't seeing people leave, in droves or really even in a strong dribble. I felt like the CEO, Stuart, was really exceptional at talking about the culture and having open communication about what does it mean to you today? If we double this next year, what do you think that means for us when we are twice this size? What's going right for you? What isn't? There were just a lot of conversations, whether it was in an all hands, in public Slack channels, where folks felt like they could be heard. And I feel like, for example, our ERGs at Slack really grew and expanded, and incredible programs came out of that because folks were looking for inclusion. They were looking for spaces. When you're not 100 people and you know everyone's first and last name, and all of a sudden you look around, you are looking for community. And so I think when you allow folks to, in a safe way, talk about what they aren't happy about, where they're feeling lost or disconnected, and then you help solve it or get to a solution and talk about what that solution is, all of these, you have to do everything. It can't just be listening. There has to be a solution. You have to talk about how the solution is going and how you're going to continue iterating and maturing and growing. That makes people feel, again, safe, heard, happy, thriving, and then they're going to do great work. And then they're going to be talking about how much they love working at your company. So I think that it's important from the top down that you're saying we can have these conversations and we will action the things that you bring up. I'm not saying every single thing will be actioned, but we will do our best. So I've remained really inspired by that, even though that was many years ago. And I think it's important for companies to, from the top down, really approach it that way.
Psychological safety is such a mega component to everything we do.
Yep.
I even think about my kids. I've said that phrase. It's like, hey, we're safe here. Like, let's just talk this out. But now, Adrienne, DEI is a big component of what your career's been focused on. What do you have to add here with the retention?
I have a lot to add on that topic in general. I'll start with the retention piece. I want to add a very heavy +1 to everything Lauren just said, particularly as it relates to creating safe spaces for people to talk through these things. I think a good example for that is early on, we were doing, learning and development stuff, and we would bring in speakers to talk about certain topics. And it was like, it's an important component, I think, to some degree of an overall culture and what the company values. But I was recently in like an engagement survey feedback focus group, talking to the team. And I brought up, well, should we do like an L&D lunch, time topic about this? And everybody just kind of like groaned. And I was like, okay, fair enough. And I think that is a good analogy for, okay, well, let's talk about, we can put these, like, if you're talking about the fact that you really value these things, but you're not seeing it from the bottom up, then it falls pretty flat. And I think if you want to do like this learning and development element and having these conversations, carving out spaces to educate or create, more resource toolkits for people across the organization and leadership and otherwise to be able to foster psychological safety themselves, there's another component to that of, yeah, the leadership should be espousing these same things. The organization should be creating spaces for people to provide real feedback. And then there should be action that follows it. And to Lauren's point, and in general, you're not going to be able to act on every piece of feedback. But generally speaking, the most important thing that you can do, besides create the safe space, is do what you can with the information that you receive to ensure that people also feel heard within those spaces.
Yeah, I know retention's a big subject, and again, I feel like it's its own webinar, and so is DEI. So to ask you to just give me one thing is a heavy lift, for sure. But I want to jump to hiring managers, because I know we have a lot to talk about, but I have to go here for sure. During this stage of growth, it's a heavy lift, right? We talked about it's everyone's job. Not everyone agrees there, but it's everyone's job. We can at least agree, right? So the question is, how can the hiring managers still do their job if they're focused just on hiring, or is hiring their job for a certain period of time? Because I think the hard part is it's like, I just need to get back to what I was hired to do. But there's a certain stage where it's like, actually what you were hired to do is build your team. So how do you have these conversations? How do you rein that in?
I think you hit the nail on the head that hiring is what bare minimum 30% of a hiring manager's job, sometimes 50, 60, 70% of their job, depending on where we are. You know, if you're at a Series C, things are going well, and it's probably well over that 50%. And it isn't just working with recruiting, being in interviews, being in debriefs, helping close candidates. They're also joining webinars. They're also speaking at events. They're also going to networking events. It's that component as well. And I think that it's important for a TA leader to make sure, again, from the top down, whether that's the CEO or the executive that is leading the function, that they're on the same page with you about that, so that then their leaders are hearing it from their cross-functional partners as well as from their boss, essentially. I feel like the best hiring partners that I've worked with have had executives who are on that same page with me. And so there weren't complaints about how much time we were taking, about how many interviews they were doing, anything like that. If everyone's on the same page there, they understand that actually is in their job description.
Yeah, well, that's the heavy thing. And again, I could always go to learning and development right now, but I won't. I'll stay right here because I think that managers need to get trained on all of these components of things. But what I hear often a lot is, when is this over? Basically, like, we want to hire really fast, but now they just took 3 to 4 days to get back. So like, obviously it's not a priority. So Adriana, I'll start with you on this one. With regards to the hiring managers, are we putting, like, is that in their performance review? Is this bonused on? Like, could we get creative with getting them, like, more to be a part of the hiring, process?
Sure. To your latter point, yes, I think that there are ways that you can bake hiring as a priority into the organization, performance, et cetera. For example, at Volley, we have interviewing as part of our overall performance structure. So, at a certain level within the organization, you are expected to contribute to hiring for your team, et cetera. You're always going to get some pushback. Hiring managers are people too. And so we get a variety of different personalities, experience levels, and understanding of what a hiring process looks like and what their role is. And so having high level alignment at the executive level, I am fortunate to have, a CEO and CTO and high level exec team that is gung ho about supporting hiring as a priority at Volley. And so that messaging trickles down. But then at the individual hiring manager level, you're playing to your team a little bit. Where does this, having a relationship with them as best you can, that's part of the intake. It's part of the overall trust that recruiting has in an organization, cross-functionally. What are you educating them on? How are you ensuring that there are things they don't know, that you're filling those skills gaps? To Lauren's earlier point about like in a negotiation documentation.
Love that. Yes.
Do you know that hiring managers know how to negotiate or get on the phone at a certain point in the hiring process and say the right thing or have the right conversation? And you can, if you'd like, if you have the resources, assume they don't and build out, documentation that supports all hiring managers that they have access to. You can take it case by case if you have a really lean talent team like we do, and work with the hiring manager that you have. I think as we're scaling, we're starting to see some of the effects of like, hey, we don't just get to like ping you and get an immediate response anymore. Now we have to take a look at our calendars shared and public. Does the coordinator have a relationship with the recruiter and the hiring manager and is involved in conversations throughout the process so that they kind of know what the nuances are of scheduling somebody? The other side of it, I guess to the point of the question is, at your organization, is there a culture of hiring as a priority? If there isn't, where can you take a look at your process to make any adjustments you might need to make to help make the gaps easier, make things run a little more efficiently? And then that last piece there is, what is the relationship that you have to the hiring manager? Are they driven by data? Are they driven by the urgency of making this hire? Do you understand what the market looks like? Have you painted a picture of the talent market for the role they're hiring for? And use the levers that you have in front of you or available to you, put that in front of your hiring manager and do what you can to make the relationship work.
I think I love, hiring managers are people, like you said, they're human, and approaching that conversation about sort of what's expected on both sides. Like if we're saying 50% of your time is going to be hiring, not just saying that. How do you feel about that? Was that the expectation that you've been discussing as a leadership team? Come into it with an open mind. And if they're like, that's the first time I've heard of it, I can't even imagine, try to come up with a solution together, right? You're not just like coming down with a hammer. That's not how I work. It should be really collaborative, and you're finding a place where you're both going to lead to success, but they feel heard. They don't feel shamed, anything like that. Like I'm thinking also about like how I approach conversations with my kids. It isn't, you should do this. It's, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about how we're going to get there and maybe how we can ease up to 50%, 25% today, 35% the next month, whatever it is. But I think curiosity and really meeting them where they're at is incredibly important so that then they're along on the ride with you.
Yep. And they're not dreading it.
Yeah.
And that trickles down when there is an understanding, at our organization, a hiring manager is going to be hiring for the team that the interviewers for that role are also on, usually direct managers. The relationship to an understanding of the interview process, what their role is, how important it is, the priority level trickles down to individuals at an IC level who are interviewing, understand their role and understand what the landscape looks like too. How long am I going to be doing this? How many hours a week am I expected to do this? I think the worst thing you can do is just throw a bunch of stuff on somebody's calendar without ensuring they have an understanding of, what are we working towards? What does the timeline look like? What are the goal hire dates? There is an end to this. Here's what we're projecting to be. So it's not just an ask without goal alignment, really, which is the hire.
And I think one more thing on that note also is I think it's really important that the recruiting leader, the recruiter, and the RC are all super available to the interview team so that for example, an IC interviewer said, I thought this was going to be maybe a month of commitment. We're going into our third month. I'm feeling underwater. You're problem solving with them to maybe someone's going to start shadowing them and taking their place and they're doing less or they're stepping back for a little bit so they can voice those as opposed to showing up to interviews flustered, overwhelmed, burnt out, and they're not representing the company well. And so I think it's really important that the IC interviewers are also able to talk about like what's going well and what isn't, because then you are one team.
Yep. You bring me right into something that I don't feel is talked about enough, which is interviewer fatigue.
Yeah.
That is a massive one, really, at any stage, but naturally, like hypergrowth, where it's like, okay, like where it's like intense and it's exciting and like more ICs are probably involved. Like, how do we have backups? How do we have, like, do we do sprints? Did, like, to Adrian's point, like, when does this end or when do we pause? Because naturally, what I see a lot is in a long interview process when essentially no one joins their team for whatever reason, because maybe the offers aren't great, or maybe no one gets past the interviews, so there's two sides to this, but teams their morale goes down. And no one has time for that, right? Like, we can't think about, like, why are we not hiring? I'm doing this for no reason. Like, there's so many things that I'm sure both of you have heard. So it's like, how do we deal with interviewer fatigue when at the end of the day we have a job to do? So, like, but Lauren, do you want to start?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so many things and so many.
I know.
This might be cheesy, but part of it is just being able to talk about it. If we're in maybe a debrief, we're not moving forward, we're all in a room and someone is like, how close are we to filling this? Like, I have done 20 interviews here and I'm exhausted and my work is falling behind, or I'm working long hours. Just being able to talk about it, I do think that is important. And then for the recruiter to be super informed and say, I know, but we have 3 folks in process. I really think one of them is it. Let's get through these and assess after that. Having that opportunity to talk about it is helpful. And it just depends on how big the org is, like the skill set. If that person, if you can get a backup for them, if you can pull someone up, have them shadow, reverse shadow, be there to kind of step in, I think that's really, really important. I think a lot of folks who aren't interviewing want to at a company. They want the honor, and you sort of don't realize that when you've been doing it day in, day out. And again, like, to point to Lattice, I felt like the hiring managers were really great at saying, someone just hit their 90 days and I think that they're ready to be pulled in. Let's get them, in the shadowing, et cetera. So just keeping that pulse on how things are going is super important, and being able to say, I'm tired, this is hard. And maybe even just hearing that other folks are feeling the same way and you're in it together can be helpful. I'm curious what you've seen, Adrian.
Sure. So this has been a big topic for us for a long time, from the outset, if you will, because there's been a reason I've been here for 3 years, and it's because we've been hiring for 3 years, because that was what somebody does. And early on, we had a small group who had developed the interviews and conducted a lot of them, and were, as a result, pulled into almost every hiring process within technical interviewing for a long time. And I realized a couple things. One, that at any time I could ping any interviewer and say, hey, we booked you for this time. How have things been going? How are you feeling? Like, how did the most recent interview go? Or check in afterwards, and take 2 seconds to check in directly and hear that feedback directly. The other side of it is when you're working with the hiring manager or any opportunity you have to connect with, the managers of those interviewers. Like, for example, recruiting and engineering at Volley have a bi-weekly meeting where we meet with all EMs. One of the things that we're looking through are interview hour distribution across engineering teams. Giving them that data, it's also something that we're looking at as a recruiting team as it relates to the coordinator. High level, we have weekly meetings. We're taking a look at how many hours of interviewing are interviewers doing across these roles. Is somebody a hiring manager for this role and also a trained interviewer for this behavioral over here, and they're doing twice as many hours of interviewing as anyone else? How do we maybe pull them out of this piece so that they can focus on this piece? There's going to be nuance depending on the size of the organization that you are. Data is your friend, as are direct relationships. We have spun up a really big kind of interviewer training process at Volley over the last year or so, taking a look at who's shadowing whom, what documentation exists, evergreen interviewer training documentation exists. So it's not a heavy lift on the hiring manager or the talent team to train people up in interviewing. How can they have access to something at any time that makes them feel like they've got the resources available to them to do a really good job? And then I think the other piece of it is, like, the direct managers of the people who are interviewing should be an ear for those interviewers to talk through concerns they have, uncertainties they have, feedback they have about the process and fatigue. We've talked really actively about, hey, we need to pull X engineer out of interviewing right now because they've got this crazy sprint and they have to ship by the end of the month and they're slammed. And that is their priority. Usually hiring is the priority, but in this case, that is their high priority. Let's pull them off and make sure we have backups in place. The final piece I'll add there is, as you grow, you start taking a look at SLAs and agreements with larger organizations so that there's something in place that each interviewer has agreed to, and that is followed. If you are agreed to 90% of the organization is interviewing, so the load is distributed and only 2 hours of interviewing a week per interviewer, obviously you can come up with these in relationship to your hiring team, as it makes sense for your org and that department. But then take a look at how to adapt your processes to align to those agreements that at a high level, are something everybody can understand what the scope of their role is in interviewing. I could probably talk about that for a lot longer, but I will.
One thing too I was going to add is a lot of the things that you're saying, it's easy to do it manually, but again, like back to the tools that we have, you can automatically set how many hours of interviews folks can do, and it flags it when you're going over it so that you're meeting the SLAs you promised those individuals, right? Using a tool like BrightHire, which is an interview intelligence platform, and looking at things like, talk times, scorecard submission, like how long do they take? Is it, your SLA of within 6 hours or whatever you set, or is it taking folks days to get them in and then biases creep in, et cetera? So I do love to kind of check in on our tools and what we have set up and making sure that we're using them to the most of their abilities. Because I think some of the things, again, like you're getting more mature. Let's have things in place that are helping us while TA teams are still running super lean, right? Let's have these tools to do the things that will help us so that we can do the one-on-one connection or, group connections with folks. And these are helping us kind of keep our SLAs in check.
That, speaking of tools, because I always think that, tools are always trying to replace us. But what no one really realizes is we've just been drowning our entire careers. This is just keeping us alive. I love that. And the check-in, because I love, Adrian, that you brought this up, is that you're using the data to see, when exactly it's been too long, right? Because I fear that people aren't going to raise their hands and say, hey, this is a lot. It's having those connections as well. We have the data and we have the connection and the relationship. And that's just super important, because what happens if there's interviewer fatigue is now they're not showing up for the candidate. So this all, comes down on the candidate experience. And it can be really sad just to be like, oh my God, we're such a great org. You just happened to catch this person at 6 hours into interviewing straight. Like, oops, we messed up. All that stuff happens. And going back to, we are human. This does happen. We can put as many things, to hopefully help us. But it's hard. It's really hard. So I'm gonna ask just one last question. I know we're have so many things. We have questions on the side here that we'll just have to get to at a different point. So we'll probably just post it and whatnot. But thank you all for being here. If you have any more questions, let us know. Hit us up. Before Series A, before Series C, sorry, before Series C hits, because y'all know what's happening, behind the scenes, right? Y'all know that it's going to happen. We're seeing the head count come up. So if you're Series B and you know it's going to hit and you're ready to go into hypergrowth, what is the one thing, I know it's hard, the one thing that you would recommend doing or make sure is in place? I know, it's a biggie. What planning?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is being aligned with the executive team on your capacity model. They have to understand what you're capable of, what you are not capable of, or what you will give up if they're asking more of what that capacity model is showing is possible. I think that's incredibly important. I've seen there be misalignment because maybe you have these incredible recruiters who can do more than, say in tech recruiting, you can do more than 6, 7 in a quarter. but that should not be the expectation. The capacity model is the first most important thing, I think.
Yep. Play that back. How long? So like I recently had a client who was like, all right, we need 6 hires within a month, and they all need to then start in a month and a half. And I was like, let's work backwards for a
Yes,
second.
exactly.
Your interview process is 6.5 hours. You only have 2 interviewers. How much can you onboard? Which I know we didn't get to that question, because onboarding
Yeah.
at a rapid speed is a big deal. But like, yeah, the working backwards, it's like no one really thinks those things through, and it's TA's job to be like, hello.
I'm a
Let's talk
really
about
visual
trouble.
person, so I do like it when the capacity model maybe has like scenario A, B, C, right?
Yes.
And then you're also saying, okay, if we're going to C, I would need to hire 2 more people onto my team. It's going to cost about this much money, et cetera. Just laying it out there so you don't get to scenario C and they don't realize what needs to happen for that.
Yep.
I'm curious what Adrian, your gut instinct was with this question.
I mean, it's essentially the same thing. It's like there's not going to be a magic. The Series C isn't like a magic shift where all of a sudden you can do all these things now. It's taking a look back at what have you done? What have the challenges been? What has your capacity been or your time to hire been? What does your team look like now? Because that is going to be the same, at this starting point. So if we're taking a look at how we want to be able to scale effectively, what have we done so far? What have our challenges been? And how do we resource those effectively? But honestly, the other side of it, I think for us as well, was having, your interview process dialed and structured, and your trainings in place, because that's the stuff that starts to really build and impact hiring decisions and outcomes and timelines. It's always 2 sides of the same coin. The other side of it for us is, does the training and documentation exist? Are the interview questions and answers clear? Do our interviewers know what they're looking for? Do we have distribution of interview expectation across organizations? Because if one person's doing it and they get burnt out, then we are really screwed. So the other side of it is, what do you have in place? We use Greenhouse, and obviously the scorecards tie back into our attributes that we have: high level company values, attributes by level, those bake down into like 5-star answers. We've got everything in place for an interviewer to be empowered, to be trained up, so that we can, on the other side of the house, scale interviewing and make effective hiring decisions.
Love that. And I was actually thinking, I think Adrian said it in the beginning, the skills gap analysis. It's like maybe before as we're thinking about the capacity planning and all of this stuff, really look and dig. Who do we need? Like, would we lose business because we didn't fill these? And then kind of go from there, because there's going to be fights in an org. This is something we also didn't get to talk about, but it's like all hiring managers want to fill their own roles, right? And that makes sense too. So it's like, who gets the attention first? And then, to essentially Daniel's question here, is, do you reach out to external help? Like, when does that make sense versus growing your team? I know we're totally out of time.
Yeah,
but it's like, there's so many,
this is going to cost you X. It should produce Y, because it does mean different things for the TA leader, but also the hiring manager's experience. And, you still have to ramp that person. So whether it's an external person or an internal person, they should still be representing your company the same way. So great question though.
This was gold. Any last things? Thank you both so much. I feel like people are gonna replay this a lot, because this was a much needed conversation. Any last things?
Just thank you for having us and having such a wonderful conversation. And I've really enjoyed our time together.
Yeah.